My mom didn't even look at me when she canceled my birthday. She stirred her tea slowly, the steam curling up between us, and said, "Your brother has problems. You can wait." I froze, clutching the small cake I had bought myself, the frosting softening through the cardboard. My hands were cold, and my chest felt hollow, like someone had quietly removed a piece of me I didn't know was missing. Luke, my brother, leaned against the table with that bored half-smile, scrolling through his phone oblivious. My throat burned, but I said nothing. I told myself it was just a small thing, a cake, but deep inside, I felt the weight of years of being overlooked, erased, and replaced, pressing down quietly like a shadow I couldn't shake. And I realized, then, that something had broken. My name is Emily Keller. I was 30 and living alone in a small, rented apartment above a nail salon in the town of Riverbend. I had always been patient, the kind of person who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who avoided conflict even when it simmered under my skin. I worked as an office clerk at a local insurance firm, filing forms for people I would never meet, quietly keeping their lives moving while mine often felt paused. That morning, I woke before my alarm. The air in my apartment was still and cold, carrying a faint chemical scent from the nail salon downstairs. I lay on my bed for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had shaped itself into a crooked bird. My chest felt heavy, tight like someone had placed a weight on it while I slept. I whispered to myself, 30 years and nothing's different. But even as I said it, I felt the familiar ache of being invisible. I showered slowly, letting the warm water run over me, though it never seemed warm enough to chase away the lingering chill in my bones. I pressed the towel against my face, feeling the rough fibers scratch at my skin, and studied my reflection in the foggy mirror. My hair was limp, my eyes tired but steady. I had always looked older than I felt inside. Years of quiet endurance etched into the corners of my mouth and the lines beneath my eyes. I dressed in simple clothes, a faded sweater and jeans, the outfit chosen more for comfort than style. My phone buzzed with a message from a coworker. "Happy birthday, Emily." I forced a small smile and replied with a quick thanks. That tiny acknowledgement, a single line of text, was the only recognition I would receive on my birthday, at least from someone who wasn't family. I went to the grocery store near the highway, walking past empty storefronts that reminded me how small our town felt. The air smelled faintly of asphalt and diesel. I bought a small round cake with pale blue icing, the color I had always found calming. I imagined setting it on my mom's kitchen table, lighting candles, maybe even hearing a laugh I hadn't heard in years. It was a simple plan, but hope had a way of building quietly inside me, even when I tried to ignore it. By the time I reached my mom's house, the sun was already climbing, casting long shadows across the pale yellow siding. The paint around the porch steps was peeling, the way it had been for years, but she never fixed it. I knocked softly, even though she had told me to just come in. Some habits die hard, even the ones that hurt. Inside, the smell of lemon cleaner was sharp and familiar. My mom stood at the counter, wearing the same gray sweater she always wore on days she didn't plan to leave the house. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, the kind that made her look more like a statue than a living person. My brother Luke sat at the table, slouched, scrolling through his phone, one foot hooked around the chair rung. "Morning," I said, my voice barely above the hum of the refrigerator. Luke didn't look up. My mom didn't even pause stirring her tea. I placed the cake on the counter, my fingers lingering on the cardboard as if it might shield me from what I knew was coming. "I thought we could have a slice together," I said, trying to inject warmth into the words, trying to hope that maybe, just maybe, this day could feel normal. My mom slid the cake back toward me, her movements slow and deliberate. "I told you not to make a big thing today," she said. "Your brother needs the attention." I felt heat rise in my chest. My throat tightened. "It's just cake," I said. "So is your pride," she replied, wiping the counter again. Her movements were mechanical, like she was erasing me with every swipe. I picked up the box, my hands trembling, and my fingers slick from the frosting already seeping through the cardboard. Luke glanced over, gave me a fleeting half-smile, then returned to his phone, oblivious to the tension in the room. "I need you to drive him to the dentist at 11, my mom added. "I have errands." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. This was nothing new. I had always done this. Carried the weight of her favoritism silently, never challenging her, always obeying. I walked out with the cake, my shoulders hunched, the air thick with unsaid words. I drove slowly, the small blue cake leaning beside me in the passenger seat like a fragile reminder of the life I didn't have in that kitchen. At the dentist, Luke barely acknowledged me. He tapped away at his phone while I sat quietly in the waiting room, hands folded over the box, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights. The cartoon on the wall TV flickered silently. I wanted to scream at the world for this small injustice, this pattern of erasure that had followed me all my life, but I stayed quiet. My fingers dug into my knees, my nails pressing into my skin until the pain grounded me. Dropping him back at home, I watched as he disappeared into the living room, leaving me outside on the porch. My mom was inside, moving around as if nothing had happened. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, the cold air making my chest ache with the rhythm of it. The sun was too bright, and for a moment, I thought about just driving away and never looking back. But I didn't. I went upstairs to my apartment. The streets quiet, carrying the heavy weight of another birthday spent unseen. And as I set the cake on my kitchen counter at home, watching the frosting slowly melt through the cardboard, I realized something I had been trying to ignore all my life. Being quiet had its cost. It left me unseen. It left me erased. And yet, the ache of that realization carried with it a strange sort of clarity. I would not disappear entirely, not this time. It wasn't always like this, or maybe it was, and I just didn't want to see it. When Luke was a child, he had asthma. The kind that made his chest tighten at night. The kind that left him gasping for air and screaming for my mom while I stood frozen in the hallway, small and silent. My mom would sleep beside him on the worn-out couch in the living room, her hand resting on his tiny back, murmuring reassurances I would never receive. I would stand in the doorway, a shadow among shadows, waiting for her to notice me. Once, when I asked her if she would tuck me in as she did him, she said, "Be a big girl, Emily. Luke needs me more tonight," and closed the door. I nodded silently, swallowing the hurt, learning early that my presence was negotiable, her love conditional. After my father left, money got tighter. Luke didn't have to work, I did. Nights spent stocking shelves at the diner, cleaning tables, counting every dollar so I could afford school supplies, textbooks, and food. Luke stayed home, my mom's golden child, the fragile one who always needed more attention. I didn't mind the work at first. I had learned patience, but slowly I began to notice patterns that stung in quiet moments. The way my mom would smile proudly at Luke's drawings, his little trophies lined up on shelves I would never touch. The way she would speak of my contributions in passing, with a dismissive shrug. I carried the small kindnesses she offered me like medals. Once at the grocery store, she thanked me for picking up Luke when he was sick. That single thank you burned bright in my memory, a fragile shard of warmth I clung to for years. I imagined it meant she loved me like she loved him, that she saw me even in small ways. But each time I hoped, the shadow of disappointment grew longer, stretching silently across my life. The first moment I realized I wasn't just overlooked but actively erased came at my college graduation. I had borrowed a cap and gown because I couldn't afford the rental fee. I remember standing on the stage, the auditorium buzzing with family and strangers, my heart pounding like a drum. I scanned the crowd until I found her, my mother. But she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were down on her phone, smiling at a message from Luke. When they called my name, she didn't even look up in time to clap. I told myself she had just missed it, that it wasn't intentional. But the hollow ache behind my ribs told me the truth. I had been erased, even in moments that should have been mine. The second blow came years later, after my grandmother died. She left small amounts of money for each grandchild, modest sums meant to help with school or bills. I expected my mother to give me mine, or at least tell me about it. Instead, she called me into the living room and handed Luke an envelope. "Spend it on something fun," she said. Then she turned to me and said, "I'll hold on to yours. You're not great with money." I laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking. She wasn't. I never saw that money. I remember the shock settling in my chest, the sudden understanding that even small promises were not safe when it came to me. After that, the erasure became subtle but relentless. My name would be missing from Christmas cards. My place set last at Thanksgiving dinners until my food was cold. She would speak of Luke's job at the auto shop with pride while forgetting to mention my promotion at the office. I tried sometimes to call it out. One afternoon, sitting across from her in the kitchen, I said quietly, "You don't treat us the same." She blinked slowly, her expression neutral. "You're imagining things," she replied. Her words struck me like a hammer on glass, breaking something I hadn't realized I had built inside myself. The belief that my life mattered equally. Even small moments stung. Once I brought home a homemade cake for my birthday, hoping to share it with her. She pushed it aside, telling me Luke needed the attention more. Another time, I achieved something important at work, a promotion I had fought for quietly, and she never acknowledged it to anyone. I learned to swallow the hurt, to walk away quietly, to pretend that it didn't matter. But the hurt accumulated like sediment, a slow, grinding erosion of my self-worth. I remember one winter evening, the house cold and smelling faintly of burnt toast. Luke was sprawled on the couch, scrolling on his phone. My mom was in the kitchen, humming softly, stirring something on the stove. I held my hands together, fingers interlaced, and tried to summon the courage to speak. "Mom, do you even notice me sometimes?" My voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't turn. "Emily," she said, not looking at me, "I'm busy. You'll have to wait." The word wait became a familiar companion in my life, a quiet reminder that I was always secondary, always less. I learned to measure my expectations carefully. I spoke less and less about my accomplishments, knowing they would be overshadowed or ignored. I smiled at Luke's successes, even as a tiny ember of resentment smoldered beneath my calm exterior. I learned to be patient, to endure quietly, to carry the ache of neglect without complaint. It became a second skin, the only way I could navigate the small, familiar betrayals of my family. By the time I turned 30, the pattern had been established for decades. My mom didn't need to raise her voice to hurt me. She could erase me with a look, a gesture, a slight pause. And when my birthday arrived that year, the final act of erasure came quietly but sharply. My cake, bought with my own money, slid back across the counter. Luke got attention. My mother didn't look at me. And the room became a stark reminder of everything I had silently endured. The frosting began to melt through the cardboard, a metaphor for my life dissolving unnoticed in plain sight. Driving Luke to the dentist that morning, I stared out the window at Riverbend, streets quiet and still. I realized then that I could no longer pretend the erasure was accidental. This was deliberate. Every omission, every dismissal, every small act of neglect was a choice my mother had made for years. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't felt for a long time. The need to reclaim my presence, to no longer be invisible in my own life. It was a quiet revelation, one that didn't come with rage or shouting. It came with an ache, slow and simmering, and the understanding that the life I had been given, one of silent endurance, was not the life I had to accept forever. And in that realization, I began to feel the first sparks of something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. Justice, quiet and deliberate, built on truth and dignity, not anger. 2 weeks after my birthday, the phone rang. My mom's voice on the other end was calm, deceptively casual. "Emily, can you come over? There's something you need to sign." I hesitated, heart tightening. I knew these calls. They weren't just about paperwork. They were always a test, a quiet assertion of control. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, already knowing I didn't want to know. "It's just a form for the house," she said. "In case something happens to me." The words made my chest ache, a slow, crawling pressure. I felt my hands grow clammy, my fingers tightening around the phone. "Fine," I said softly, my voice sounding small even to me. When I arrived at her house, the living room smelled sharply of lemon cleaner. Luke was leaning against the fireplace, arms crossed, that familiar bored expression on his face. I placed my purse on the couch, trying to keep my hands steady. My mother gestured for me to sit at the table, where a neat stack of papers waited. I opened the folder and froze. My name appeared under a paragraph about waiving interest in the house. My chest constricted. My stomach twisted. "You're taking me off the deed?" I asked, my voice a whisper. You don't live here anymore, she replied, as if that settled everything. I tried to steady my breathing. You promised me half. Years ago. You told me. Plans change, she interrupted, calm and measured. I stared at the papers, my fingers clutching the edge of the folder until my nails dug into my palms. Heat crawled up my neck. I could feel the blood pounding behind my eyes. I wanted to scream, to demand justice, to shake her and make her see what she was doing, but I stayed silent. I had learned long ago that rage in her presence only made me smaller. Luke finally spoke, his voice hesitant. You told me it was just mine. I looked at him, my heart twisting. She told me something else. I said, my voice quiet but firm. The realization of how long she had played us against each other burned in my chest. My mother's eyes remained unreadable, fixed on the papers. Her calmness was infuriating, a quiet weapon that had always kept me in place. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment, the kitchen light dim, the blue frosting of my birthday cake long gone. The letter from a lawyer had arrived, confirming my mother's restructuring of the estate. My name was misspelled. My pulse throbbed in my ears. The documents were clear. She was erasing me legally, systematically. I remembered every birthday she had overshadowed, every small accomplishment she had ignored. Each memory was like a weight pressing against my chest. My apartment felt too small, the air too heavy. I pressed my hands to the table, feeling the cold surface under my fingers, trying to ground myself. I could almost hear her voice, soft and cutting. Plans change. Sleep refused me. Nights became a blur of tossing, turning, and pacing the apartment. I replayed every childhood scene where I had been ignored, erased, pushed aside. The way she praised Luke for small tasks while overlooking my years of labor. The way she had used me to carry burdens quietly, while Luke was protected, celebrated, loved. One night, I sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling, staring at the ceiling. I'm done waiting, I whispered. My voice cracked, but the words felt heavy, solid, true. For the first time, I realized that enduring quietly had reached its limit. I could continue being polite, patient, invisible, or I could reclaim what was rightfully mine. The next day, I went to the county office to review the property records. My mother had filed new paperwork. The clerk's words were blunt, almost cruel in their simplicity. There's nothing you can do unless you contest it. My stomach dropped. I felt the familiar sting of helplessness, the one I had carried since childhood. But this time, I didn't let it root me in place. I made a note of the forms, the filing numbers, every piece of evidence I could find. Back at home, I sat on the kitchen floor, the cold tiles pressing into my legs. I spread out old receipts, letters, emails, anything that could show her promises over the years. I wanted to scream, cry, run, but I just sat, letting the plan form in my mind, letting the quiet fire grow. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the water-stained ceiling bird, tracing its shape with my eyes. I thought of all the birthdays she had stolen, all the small humiliations that had piled up, all the moments when I had been erased. And I realized, I didn't need to fight her loudly. I could be quiet, patient, deliberate, and when the time came, she wouldn't have a choice. The first step was gathering proof. The second was finding witnesses. The third, the most dangerous, was facing her without breaking under the weight of years of neglect. And through it all, one thought echoed in my mind like a drumbeat. I won't beg anymore. I won't wait. I won't let her erase me. The next morning, I received a text from Luke. Mom's really serious about this. Be careful. I stared at the screen, heart racing. For the first time, I realized that even the people closest to her were part of the machine she had built. One that erased me, quietly, deliberately, for decades. I pressed my phone down on the counter, my hands trembling. The quiet fire inside me flared, growing stronger, controlled. And I knew one thing. The time to stay silent was over. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, scattered papers all around me, a notebook open to list witnesses, emails, and important dates. My pulse thrummed in my temples. The silence of my apartment was almost suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the heater. I traced each promise my mother had made, each lie she had quietly built, each injustice carefully stacked. And as I stared at the ceiling, Hands pressed to my face, a thought whispered through the ache in my chest. She has erased me for the last time. Sleep became a stranger to me after that day. Nights stretched endlessly. The apartment quiet except for the faint hum of the nail salon below and the occasional passing car. I would lie on my bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the water stain that had always looked like a crooked bird. It had been there for years, unnoticed by everyone but me. Now it felt like a silent witness to my life, one spent largely in the shadows of my mother's attention and my brother's needs. I remembered the nights I had spent waiting by his bed, listening to his wheezing, hearing my mother murmur gentle reassurances that were never meant for me. I had learned to disappear, to fade quietly into the background. But the weight of years of invisibility pressed against my chest now with a new urgency. Every act of erasure, every birthday ignored, every small humiliation, returned to me in vivid detail. I paced my apartment, barefoot on the cold tiles, feeling the chill bite into my feet. I traced the outlines of the furniture, counting the steps between the kitchen and the bedroom, the living room and the bathroom, as if mapping a path that could lead me back to some sense of power. My mind replayed moments from my childhood, memories I had carefully tucked away. The time my mother had pushed my cake aside, because Luke needed attention more. The afternoon she gave him the envelope from Grandma, and told me she would hold mine because I wasn't responsible with money. The quiet dismissals of my achievements, the constant comparisons, the subtle favoritism that carved me smaller in every encounter. I could feel the sting of each memory as sharply as if it were happening now. My hands trembled as I touched the blue frosting on my own forgotten birthday cake, the sweet, sticky remnants a bitter reminder of all the times I had been overlooked. I couldn't scream. That would have been too easy, and it would have been exactly what my mother wanted. A reaction I could be punished for. A moment where she could feel justified in her quiet cruelty. I had learned to contain it, to let it sit in my bones, building quietly until it became something else, something stronger. I sat on the edge of my bed, wrapping my arms around my knees. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in, suffocating. My mind raced with every injustice, every slight, every day I had been ignored. And yet, beneath the pain, a clarity began to grow. This wasn't just about a birthday or a house. It was about my existence, my presence, my right to be seen and acknowledged. I remembered the nights I had spent crying silently in the bathroom, my face pressed to the cool tile, listening to the sound of my own breathing, as if it were the only proof I existed. Those nights had hardened me, shaped me into someone who could endure almost anything. But now the endurance felt different. It felt like preparation. Preparation for reclaiming what had always been mine, quietly, deliberately, without giving her the satisfaction of anger or desperation. I began to write things down. Names of people who had witnessed my mother's favoritism. Dates and details of the promises she had made and broken. Every small act of erasure catalogued meticulously in a notebook I had carried out of habit from college. My hands shook as I wrote, but I wrote anyway, each word a small act of defiance. Sometimes I would stop and stare out the window, watching the streets of Riverbend empty and quiet in the early hours. The small town felt claustrophobic, the rows of identical houses and shuttered shops a reflection of the life I had led. Predictable, overlooked, invisible. And yet I realized that the town, like my life, could not erase me unless I let it. I thought about my mother, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, calm and collected, sliding the papers across for me to sign. The way she had told me to wait, to step aside, to accept that Luke was the favored child. The way she had smiled at his accomplishments while I sat in silence, unseen. I could almost feel the weight of her calmness pressing against me now. A physical force trying to push me back into my old patterns. But something inside me had shifted. I could feel it in my chest, a steady burn that was not anger, not fury, but determination. It was quiet, controlled, deliberate. I realized that I did not need to beg for her attention, her approval, or her love. I did not need to compete for recognition that had never been fairly offered. I only needed to stand firm, to gather the truth, to let it speak louder than any words I could raise in anger. I began pacing again, circling the apartment, my steps measured, almost meditative. I reviewed every childhood memory, every slight, every overlooked achievement. I let the pain surface fully, allowed it to fill me completely, and then I released it into something actionable. Each memory became a note, a piece of evidence, a reason to fight. Not for revenge in the way others think of it, but for my dignity, my place in my own life. Nights blurred into days. I sat at my kitchen table with old receipts, emails, letters, and photographs spread before me. My hands moved quickly, almost frantically, but my mind was precise. I cataloged, cross-referenced, and prepared. I called a few relatives quietly, asking questions about what they remembered. I checked dates and details of promises my mother had made, the ones that she thought had been forgotten. Each small confirmation strengthened the quiet fire inside me. I slept in short bursts, waking to write down thoughts, ideas, and potential strategies. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night, walk barefoot to the window, and watch the moonlight spill over the empty streets. My pulse raced, my chest ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. This was no longer about her or Luke, or the injustice of the house. It was about me, reclaiming my life, my presence, my self-respect. One night, as I sat on the cold kitchen floor, surrounded by my notes and the fading light of a single lamp, I pressed my palms to my face and whispered, "I'm done waiting. I won't beg anymore." My voice was small, fragile, but the words were solid in my mind. I felt something inside me click into place, a quiet determination that could not be shaken by years of erasure or favoritism. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to imagine the moment when I would confront the truth, fully armed with evidence, witnesses, and undeniable facts. I didn't imagine anger or confrontation. I imagined clarity. I imagined dignity. I imagined the satisfaction of being seen, finally, for everything I had endured and achieved quietly, patiently unseen. I realized I didn't need to yell, cry, or fight in the ways I had been taught. The quiet, deliberate accumulation of truth and preparation would be more powerful than any outburst. She had underestimated me all these years. She had assumed I would accept my place quietly, as I always had. But now, I wasn't just preparing to fight for a piece of property or recognition. I was preparing to reclaim my identity, my self-worth, my presence in my own life. I sat there long after midnight, watching the shadows stretch across the walls, feeling the quiet fire burn steadily inside me. I wasn't going to beg anymore. I wasn't going to wait. I wasn't going to let decades of erasure define the rest of my life. And as exhaustion finally claimed me, I closed my eyes with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. This fight would be silent, deliberate, and undeniable. The first thing I did was organize everything I had: old receipts, emails, letters, and photographs. Each one was a fragment of the life I had lived quietly, the proof of my presence, my contributions, my years of silent endurance. I spread them across the small table in my apartment, letting the yellow lamplight illuminate every detail. Each paper, each digital screenshot felt heavier than it should have. Every line, every signature, every timestamp carried decades of overlooked existence. I created a timeline. I wrote down birthdays that had been ignored, gifts that had been dismissed, promotions that had gone unacknowledged. I noted every instance when my mother had favored Luke, erased me, or minimized my efforts. The list grew long, painful, and intoxicating. It wasn't revenge in the way people imagined. No screaming, no doors slammed. It was methodical. It was deliberate. It was mine. Next, I reached out quietly to relatives. My aunt, who had always seemed sympathetic but hesitant, was the first. I asked her about the envelope from Grandma, the money she had given Luke, and whether she remembered me being excluded. She hesitated at first, shifting in her chair, glancing away. "I thought it was odd," she said finally. "I just didn't want to interfere. You were always so quiet." Her words both stung and strengthened me. She remembered. Someone did. I dug through old emails between my mother and me, searching for promises she had made, records of discussions about the house, about responsibilities I had carried alone. There were fragments of kindness buried in the text, lines that proved she had once acknowledged me, and lines she had later contradicted. I printed everything, highlighted every instance that mattered. I even revisited the old property records at the county office. The clerk looked at me with mild annoyance as I requested documents from years past. "Do you know what you're doing?" he asked. I nodded, keeping my voice low. Yes. I'm just confirming details. Every paper I copied, every record I scanned, felt like a tiny victory, a brick in the wall I was quietly building against her erasure. But then came the first real setback. My mother's lawyer returned my call curtly. Your mother's intentions are clear, he said. She wants to remove you from the deed. Legally, she's allowed to proceed unless you contest it. My hands trembled around the phone. The blood seemed to drain from my face. I gripped the kitchen counter, nails digging into the wood, my chest tightening. I felt the familiar sting of helplessness, the one I had known since childhood. But this time, I refused to let it root me in place. I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the cold kitchen air. I would contest it. I would find witnesses. I would gather every document, every proof, every detail my mother thought she had erased. I realized then that the fight would not be fast. It would be slow, careful, exhausting, but it would be worth it. Over the next few weeks, I spent long nights in my apartment, reviewing everything repeatedly. Each email, each bank record, each note from relatives was cataloged meticulously in a notebook. I wrote down dates, amounts, promises, and contradictions. I made folders labeled by year, by event, by significance. I became obsessed with details, with precision. I knew that one slip, one misstep, and my careful work could crumble. I even enlisted a friend from work, someone who had been quietly observant for years. He reviewed my documents, helping me cross-check dates and proof. He suggested ways to present the evidence clearly, logically, without emotion overtaking the facts. Together, we mapped out a strategy. First, gather undeniable proof. Second, secure witnesses who remembered my mother's promises and favoritism. Third, confront her in a formal setting where she could no longer ignore reality. But the setback came again when one witness, a distant relative, refused to cooperate. I don't want to get involved, she said over the phone, voice tight. I'm sorry, Emily. I just don't want to cause trouble. I felt the familiar ache of disappointment. I had hoped someone would validate my experience, but this was part of the risk I had known from the start. Not everyone would see the truth. Some people would be too afraid to act. I reminded myself why I was doing this. It wasn't for anger. It wasn't for revenge in the dramatic sense. It was for dignity. It was for acknowledgement. It was to prove, first to myself and then to the world, that I existed and deserved to be seen. I let the sting of rejection settle, and then moved forward. One lost witness would not stop me. Another challenge came when I discovered a gap in the property records. The deed had been partially updated years ago, and some documents were missing. I spent hours at the county office, searching microfiche, old ledgers, and archives. My eyes burned from the fluorescent lights, my fingers cramped from holding the thin pages, but I persisted. Finally, after several long days, I found a document that proved my claim. A promise my mother had made in writing, a commitment that could not be ignored. The weight lifted slightly from my chest, but I knew the battle was far from over. Even at home, the emotional strain was heavy. I would sit in my apartment late at night, tracing the timeline of my life, the injustices stacked like bricks around me. My chest would tighten, my hands tremble, my stomach knot. And yet, beneath the discomfort, a quiet satisfaction grew. Every detail I uncovered, every proof I documented, every small victory over her meticulous erasure, fed the fire that had begun months ago. There were moments when I wanted to give up, to let her silence win, to accept invisibility as I had so often done before. But each time, I remembered the cake sliding across the counter, the envelopes handed to Luke, the birthdays erased, the accomplishments ignored. The quiet ache in my chest, the lingering sting of decades, reminded me of what I had endured and why I could not stop. Finally, I had enough. Enough documents, enough witnesses, enough proof. My apartment looked like a war room. Papers scattered across every surface, notes tacked to walls. I could almost see the path laid out in front of me. A slow, deliberate march toward exposing the truth. I had faced setbacks, yes. I had felt helplessness, frustration, and doubt. But I had persisted, quietly, patiently, deliberately. And as I sat at my kitchen table, fingers tracing the edges of the last document I had found. I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. This was the moment before action. The calm before the confrontation. The stillness before the truth would finally be undeniable. My chest tightened, but it was different this time. It was not fear. It was focus. I whispered to myself in the silence, the words steady and deliberate. This ends the way it should. Quietly, truthfully, undeniably. The day finally arrived. I walked into my mother's kitchen carrying a neat stack of documents, folders organized with meticulous care. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the same smell that had haunted my childhood memories. Luke was there, leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone, a faint smirk playing on his lips. My mother stirred tea slowly, humming as if nothing had changed. But today, the calm that had always suffocated me was about to meet its match. I placed the folders on the table, aligning them neatly in front of her. "Mom," I said, my voice steady, calm, unshakable. "We need to talk about the house. And about every promise you made that affected my life." She raised her eyebrows, glancing briefly at Luke, then back at me. "Emily, I don't see why this has to be complicated," she said, her tone measured. "We've been over this." I opened the first folder and began laying out my evidence. Letters, emails, photographs, receipts. All the small fragments of decades of being erased, ignored, and replaced. I spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure every word landed softly but firmly. "Here are the birthdays you overlooked. Here's the money Grandma left me, which you handed to Luke. Here are the accomplishments you never acknowledged, the times you prioritized him over me, even when I needed you most." My mother's fingers paused over her teacup. Her lips pressed together, eyes flicking to the papers. Luke's phone slipped from his hands. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I continued, holding each document carefully. "I've spoken to relatives, co-workers, and friends. Everyone remembers the pattern. Everyone remembers the promises, the favoritism, the dismissals. This isn't imagination. This isn't exaggeration. It's fact. And I have proof." My mother's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't raise her voice. She never did. That calm had always been her weapon. But today her calm began to crack, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. Luke finally spoke, voice quieter now. I didn't realize." He looked at her, then at me, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. I thought it was just how things were." I gave him a small nod, my own chest tight with restrained emotion. "It's how things have been," I said softly. "And it stops now." I opened another folder, this one containing property records and documents from the county office. "Here's the house," I said. "The deeds, the records, every update you filed. You tried to remove me quietly, legally. But it's all here. Your attempts to erase me, your deliberate actions, all documented." My mother's hands froze over the table. She didn't speak. The air in the kitchen felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I could see it in her eyes. The realization that her control, built over decades, was slipping. That the careful web of favoritism and erasure she had spun so quietly was finally visible, undeniable. I let the silence linger. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't demand. I simply let the truth exist in the room, tangible and undeniable. I watched her, calm and deliberate, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. Finally she spoke, voice low, brittle. I didn't realize," she trailed off, the words failing to carry any defense. Her calmness, always so precise, was gone. She stirred the tea once, then set it down, staring at the table. Not a shout, not a tantrum, just the quiet collapse of authority. Luke glanced at me again, eyes wide. "Mom, she's right. I get it now." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of years of misunderstanding and inherited bias settling over him. I reached for the final folder, one containing my notes from relatives and co-workers who had observed her favoritism over the years. "These are witnesses," I said quietly. "People who can confirm what's been happening. People who remember." Her shoulders slumped slightly. No words. No defense. just the hollow weight of truth pressing down on the quiet kingdom she had built. I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The fight had been long, deliberate, painstaking, but the truth could no longer be denied. I had not shouted, had not stormed, had not begged. I had simply documented reality and let it speak for itself. And in that moment, I understood something deeper than satisfaction. I hadn't just proven my mother wrong. I had reclaimed myself. My presence, my dignity, my life. She could no longer erase me with calm words or subtle dismissals. She could no longer shape my existence with silence. Luke reached for my hand, hesitating, then squeezed gently. "I'm sorry," he said, voice small. "I should have seen it sooner." I nodded, accepting the apology without needing it to heal the decades of quiet pain. My mother said nothing. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. Her collapse was silent, internal, and far more powerful than any outburst could have been. I left the house that day with a quiet, steady heart. The folders were still on the table, her silence lingering, heavy and absolute. I knew she would never shout or make a scene. That was her way. But the truth had entered the room, undeniable, and that was enough. Driving home, I felt the tension in my chest slowly ease. My hands gripped the steering wheel lightly, no longer trembling. The air felt clearer, the streets wider, the town smaller somehow because my life, my existence, was no longer defined by her erasure. For the first time in decades, I felt a strange sense of peace. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't begged. I had been deliberate, patient, and unshakable. And now, finally, the truth had spoken louder than any subtle dismissal, any quiet favoritism, any years of being unseen. The days after the confrontation were quieter than I expected. The folders remained on the kitchen table at my mother's house, untouched. I didn't need to check. The truth had been laid bare, undeniable. My mother didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't try to erase me again. She moved around the house with her usual calmness, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a heaviness in her silence that hadn't been there before. It was as if the careful control she had built over decades had quietly dissolved. Luke approached me one afternoon, while I sat in my apartment sipping lukewarm tea. "Emily," he said softly, hesitant. "I want to help. I don't want her mistakes to continue affecting you." His eyes were earnest, a flicker of guilt still lingering. I nodded, a small smile forming. "It's okay. You're learning. That's what matters." I spent the following weeks sorting through my own life in ways I hadn't allowed myself before. I reviewed old documents, emails, and photographs, not to prepare for another confrontation, but to reclaim my history. Each note, each record, each memory I had cataloged became a testament to my resilience. I realized I had spent decades being silent, enduring, disappearing quietly. And now, I could finally acknowledge my own presence. The apartment felt lighter. I rearranged the furniture, cleared out old papers that no longer mattered, and opened the curtains to let the sunlight spill across the floors. The small blue cake from my birthday, long gone, had left its mark on the counter, a sticky reminder of the past, but it no longer carried the same weight. It was just a memory now, a marker of the life I had endured and survived. I began to focus on my own growth, my own accomplishments, independent of recognition from my mother or anyone else. I signed up for evening classes at a community college, something I had postponed for years, quietly dreaming of learning again. I joined a small book club, connecting with people who valued my presence and voice. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving quietly, I was living deliberately. Visits to my mother's house became rare and measured. I spoke to her calmly, without anger or accusation. She never apologized, never acknowledged the years of erasure directly, but the silence between us had changed. I didn't need her recognition anymore. I didn't need her approval. I only needed to witness her quiet awareness of the truth, which was evident in the subtle shifts of her demeanor, the slight hesitations in her speech, the careful weight of her movements around me. One evening, I walked past Riverbend's quiet streets, the sun setting behind the low hills. The town felt smaller, more contained, yet I felt larger somehow. My life was no longer dictated by someone else's favoritism or omissions. My accomplishments, my presence, my dignity, they were mine. The years of patient endurance had finally led to clarity, and clarity had led to quiet liberation. Even Luke changed subtly. He began acknowledging me in small ways that hadn't happened before, asking for advice, sharing his own achievements, recognizing my quiet strength. It wasn't forced. It wasn't dramatic. It was natural, deliberate, like the slow but undeniable growth of something once hidden. I spent long nights reflecting, often sitting by the window, listening to the faint hum of the town below. The ache from years of erasure lingered, but it no longer defined me. I had carried it deliberately, allowed it to fuel quiet determination, and transformed it into something empowering. My mother had been a formidable obstacle, but she was no longer a defining force in my life. Her calmness, once a weapon, had lost its power over me. And in that quiet, deliberate space, I finally understood what I had fought for. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't power or dominance. It was acknowledgement of my life, my presence, my worth. It was the ability to live without shrinking, to exist without apology, to reclaim the space I had always deserved. I realized that the world was full of small injustices, subtle erasures, quiet cruelties, but truth, patience, and deliberate action could expose them. My victory wasn't loud. It wasn't celebrated. It was quiet, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But to me, it was everything. I kept the folders, the letters, the documents, not as weapons but as reminders. Proof that I had endured, proof that I had resisted quietly, proof that I had reclaimed my life. And every morning, I woke to the sunlight spilling across my apartment floor, the air carrying the faint scent of possibility, knowing that the quiet dignity I had cultivated was now mine to carry, unshaken, undeniable. Walking through the streets of Riverbend, I felt a calm satisfaction, a soft power that didn't need validation. I wasn't just the patient girl overlooked anymore. I was Emily Keller, 30, quiet but resolute, resilient and deliberate, and finally unshakable. Sitting by my window, watching the late afternoon sunlight stretch across Riverbend, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see for decades. Dignity doesn't come from recognition or approval. It doesn't come from being seen by those who have chosen to ignore you. It comes from standing quietly in your own truth, from holding yourself steady when the world tries to erase you. I had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, and replaced. My mother had been a master at quiet cruelty, at favoritism, at erasure. But I had endured. I had cataloged every slight, every broken promise, every subtle humiliation. And in doing so, I had built something stronger than anger or revenge. I had built clarity, patience, and deliberate power. Revenge isn't about shouting or striking. It isn't about dramatics or confrontation. True revenge, I realized, is far quieter. It is the calm reclamation of your life, the unwavering insistence that your existence matters, that your story matters, and that your dignity cannot be stolen. It is holding the mirror to the truth and letting the world, those who mattered and those who didn't, see it for what it is. I think of my mother now, quietly carrying the weight of her own awareness. She didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't beg me to forgive her. She simply faced the undeniable truth. The life she tried to control could no longer be shaped by her choices alone. And I didn't need her validation. I didn't need apologies. I only needed the certainty that I had reclaimed myself. Walking through the streets of Riverbend, I no longer feel small. I no longer feel erased. I carry my history, my memories, my pain, and my triumph quietly but firmly, knowing they have shaped me into someone unshakable. Life isn't about winning loudly. It's about surviving, rebuilding, and returning to yourself stronger than before. I am Emily Keller, 30, quiet, patient, deliberate. I endured, I observed, and I reclaimed. And in that quiet reclamation, I finally found peace. Not revenge, not power, just truth, just dignity, just survival.